Welcome back everybody to our studies in the making of modern Britain. This video is going to spend some time talking about the societal changes, the society that existed in the post-war era between 1951 and 1964. There's a lot of things that we're going to talk about here. We're going to explore the rising of living standards, the impact of affluence and consumerism, the changing social attitudes and tensions, class and the establishment. We'll talk about the position of women, and we'll talk about attitudes towards immigration, racial violence, and then finally think about the emergence of the teenager and youth culture. And I want to just begin with a basic introductory feature by explaining that the years following the Second World War was marked by a period of quite significant social change. The rising of living standards and this growth of affluence and consumerism meant that we see a huge shift in the cultural zeitgeist of the time, the cultural ideas. And really, the idea of the affluent society is the idea that is described most commonly and most commonly associated with the 1950s and the 1960s. So, what are the features of this affluent society then? Well, we see that there is clearly economic growth. That was something that we looked at in the previous video. The post-war economic boom begins in the early 1950s and does go into the 1960s, despite there being some increasing pressures, things like inflation and balance of payments issues. We know that wages increased. We know that unemployment remained particularly low, averaging around 2% year on year, going as low as 200,000 people by 1955, which is less than 1%. All of which contributing to a general improvement in living conditions for many British families. The result is that real wages grow for many workers. From 1952 onwards, it was clear that the economic indicators that measure performance of an economy were improving. According to some statistics, for example, we see men's weekly wages go from roughly £8.30 in 1951 to as high as £15.35 by 1961, 10 years later. And so just in a decade, you see a huge increase in men's weekly wages. There is massive increases in private savings as a result. We see that there is massive investment and massive improvements in the living standards of those who work in the agricultural sector, partially as the result of generous subsidies. And we see that there is the complete ending of food rationing by 1954, which basically extends quite expansively the amount of consumerism and growth and rising of living standards. The growth of what we would describe as mass consumerism was also a very key feature of this period. More people began to buy household goods, things like televisions and refrigerators and washing machines and cars, and these items, which were once luxuries, became common in many middle-class homes and transformed daily life. We can see, for example, that car ownership increases by around 25% between 1957 and 1959. We get this idea of the affluent society, this new sense of affluence. The development of suburban areas also accelerates during this period. New towns were built to accommodate the growing population. We see housing developments begin to cater to families, giving rise to an idealized and suburban lifestyle. This whole impact meant that we see that there is a drive towards materialism and conformity. The rise of affluence came with the emergence of a consumer-driven society. There was the widespread availability of consumer goods. This comes with it the idea of a degree of social conformity, people largely following traditional roles, particularly in terms of gender and class. There is this desire to maintain a quote-unquote respectable lifestyle, and this is a dominant feature of post-war Britain. There was also a cultural pressure to live according to social norms of the time. This kind of pressure, though, does not exist in when we think about youth culture, which we'll get to and explore a little bit more later on in this video. But the rise of consumerism, alongside mass production, leads to a new cultural phenomenon: development of youth cultures and the growing importance of the so-called teenager as a distinct social group. And so ultimately then, when we think about changing social attitudes and issues concerning things like class and the establishment, we can see that despite there being a clear rise in living standards, and there is this clear idea of the so-called affluent society, there is still nevertheless divisions among certain areas, such as that of class divisions. British society remained deeply divided along class lines, and although economic boom allowed for some upward mobility, i.e. people from lower classes achieving the kinds of standards of living as the higher classes, the upper classes, the so-called establishment, retained significant power during this time. And the establishment referred to the sort of traditional elites, the politicians, the aristocrats, the influential figures from the military, from businesses, and from religious sectors. This was ultimately marked by a number of major issues during this time period. There was a sort of general resentment and class consciousness against the establishment. Things like the Suez Crisis illustrated such issues of sort of the establishment getting involved in issues of major international embarrassment. We have also things like sex scandals, such as the Profumo affair, again illustrating the idea of sleaze around these upper class aristocrats, essentially. Working class communities then continue to face certain economic disadvantages as well, like lower wages, few educational opportunities, and poor living conditions. As British society modernised, there was also a growing shift towards this idea of individualism and collective personal freedom, in contrast to the idea of collectivism. People began to question established norms and traditional ideas about things like authority and gender roles and social expectations. The shift was reflected in cultural changes, such as the growing importance of rock and roll music, the beginnings of a counterculture, the importance of youth culture. The Butler Education Act of 1944, before the era that we're studying, ultimately had an impact on the events that we see in the 50s and 60s. It created a greater sense of educational opportunity, despite the fact that there was still clearly barriers to entry for a lot of people within education. But the Butler Education Act of 1944 created this tripartite system of education and established the idea of the secondary modern, the grammar, and the technical school. Within the broader society then, let's look at some of the specific groups within this society. We'll start with women, we'll talk about race relations, and then we'll finish by looking at youth culture. So, in the early 1950s, women's roles in Great Britain was largely confined to the domestic sphere. Women were expected to marry, they were expected to raise children, and they were expected to manage the household. And this reinforces the ideal of the nuclear family as a cornerstone of society. The post-war economic boom does see a small increase in women entering the workforce. They, of course, entered the heavy industry of the workforce during the Second World War, when they worked on the home front as all the men went off the war. And while they never went back to the kinds of social structures and expectations that you see prior to the war completely changes the role of women forever. They still nevertheless did not essentially be accepted. They were not accepted as heavily and as expectedly in heavy industries like they were during the war. And so they still entered the workforce with a small increase in entering the workforce, but in areas such as clerical work and retail and healthcare. Many women who had worked during the war left that workforce when the war ended, but others did continue to seek employment, and we start to see a growing service sector during this time where women often flooded to work there instead. But during this time, there was no stopping the rise and the resurface of feminism as a social issue by the 50s and early 60s. Women began to demand more rights, including better education, the right to work, and a broader range of in a broader range of professions, so new working environments, as well as equality in marriage. You see, for example, writers like Betty Friedan in the United States and activists in Great Britain begin to challenge traditional gender roles, and these kinds of things spread across the pond in a number of different ways. Finally, then, let's talk about racial tensions and the emergence of the teenager, the emergence of youth cultures and the teenager. In terms of immigration, essentially what happens at the end of the Second World War is that there is a demand for new industrial workers. There's a demand for a greater amount of labour. And this demand is essentially satisfied by the importing of immigrants from the Commonwealth, the sort of the latter part of the empire, the other parts of the empire. The most prominent and prevalent of this generation is known as the Windrush generation, who arrived from the Caribbean after the Second World War on a ship known as the HMS Windrush. And these, as well as other Commonwealth immigrants, came to Britain to seek work and better opportunities, and did contribute significantly to the post-war boom in terms of the economy. But they did face discrimination and prejudice. We see that essentially by 1958, around 210,000 Commonwealth immigrants had settled in Britain. So we see quite a significant increase in the amount of immigrants that are settling in this time period. The result is that immigration from the Caribbean and India and Pakistan lead to social tensions, particularly in urban areas. Racial prejudice is still very much widespread. Immigrants are still facing poor housing conditions, low-paying jobs, and in many cases, just overt racism from parts of society. The result is this idea of racial violence, most illustrative of the idea here of the Notting Hill riots of 1958. These tensions were exacerbated by political movements, the rise of right-wing nationalist groups, individuals such as Oswald Mosley, who attempted to run for election off the back of the Notting Hill riots in the later 1950s, for example. In terms of youth culture, then, we see the emergence of the teenager as a distinct social identity, shaped by an increasing disposable income, access to greater entertainment, and the growing cultural influence of the United States. The youth of this era, then, were able to embrace new forms of self-expression, primarily through music and fashion and new social attitudes. The rise of rock and roll music with artists like Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry became icons, and the British youth embraced this new genre of music, and it became synonymous with the idea of teenage identity and teenage rebellion. In terms of fashion, this became another way for teenagers to be able to distinguish themselves from the older, stuffier generations. The so-called teddy boys, a youth subculture that was characterized by flamboyant clothing and sort of rebellious attitudes, would begin to emerge in the 1950s. The teddy boys essentially emerged as a youth subculture as a way of rejecting traditional norms and embracing individualism over collectivism. And then finally, the late 50s and early 60s sees the rise of the mods and rockers subcultures, the beatniks, for example, representing different attitudes towards fashion and music and lifestyle. The mods, on the one hand, were more urban and embraced modernity and style, whereas the rockers were often associated with the idea of motorcycle culture, something that also became more and more prevalent as we see an increase in the rise of living standards as well.